We had moved into a bigger house when my little sister made her arrival. Mom went directly to the neighbor's house, and we were all standing and tiptoeing at the upstairs veranda, trying to get a glimpse of the baby. Later in the afternoon, they all came home and we were thrilled to be able to hold the newborn. We were taught how to support the head when holding her, and it was a proud moment indeed when I held her all on my own, even if it was only for a minute or so. Later, when Teresa was in the crib, I crept up close to have a better look, and when I realized that she was not asleep, I put my hand through the vertical slots and touched her hand. It was very pink, and I noticed what looked like cotton wool between her fingers, and so I put my index finger into her hand, and she grabbed it. I was taken aback when I felt how hard she held on to it. I got scared and ran downstairs and didn't go near her again for the entire day. With my 2-year-old brother Anthony as my sidekick, we would pretend to be the bosses over my sisters. Bernadette took orders and did as she was told most of the time. But Liz was the independent one and would foil our fun by ordering us to bed whenever she got tired of us. 1963 was an eventful year as we had moved further from the centre of town to Durban Street, in a part of town called Lodge. It was at the outermost edge of Georgetown. Not more than a quarter of a mile further, and all civilization would cease. Traveling any further and you would be at the edge of the jungle, or what we called the back dam. Mom got pregnant again, and on the 18th of April, there was a general strike in the country that was to last for 80 days, culminating on the 8th of July. During this time, there were lots of trouble in the city, with rioting, burning of buildings, and many people were attacked. Some even lost their lives. We heard these things from the big people, the adults, who always discussed these matters in hushed tones. The stores were running low on groceries. Most had completely run out and so were closed. Neighbors would barter rice for sugar or other items. There was no electricity at all. Kerosene was nowhere to be found. So like all our neighbors, we acquired a coal pot. But there was no coal to buy. We had to search for old wood to use as fuel. It got so bad that at night people would come and rip out the wooden staves of the paling fencing to use as fuel. So we had to take it in turns to stay up at night to guard the property. In those days, the thieves were more afraid of you than it is today. So once you had armed yourself with a staff, you felt confident in warding off potential trouble. Once the paling staves were used up, we had to use the wooden doors of the old building at the back of our property. We even used 2 of the bedroom doors from our own home. Our house looked out onto the main road near an intersection called Hill Street. We had a bird's eye view of the road. So when the Limeys, the British soldiers, came, we were lucky to see one evening just before sundown at around 6 p.m. an army helicopter just outside our window. It was a little to the left and slightly above our house. It was stationary in mid-air, and a number of soldiers were sliding down a rope to the road surface. It was scary times, and we eventually closed our windows and remained inside. I never knew where they went, but it was very late before we turned in for the night. At nights, the vigilantes would come out wearing hoods over their heads. They were men who would stand in a line across the street and stop any car that came down the road, perhaps searching for weapons or whatever. Sometimes the cars would speed up and all the men would run helter-skelter in all directions. Because there were not many cars in Georgetown at the time, and since petrol was very scarce due to the strike, most of the cars might have been government-owned or people with connections to get petrol. Therefore, cars on the road would be few and far between. These events for us children were just brief punctuations in an otherwise happy and carefree childhood. We were in awe of the coal pot, and both myself and my brother Anthony, whom we called Tony, would go hunting for wood and would light the fire when Mom was ready to cook. It was fascinating just seeing the flames shoot ever so high, more than was needed, and when Mom shouted that it was enough, and rested the pot on top to begin cooking, then the excitement would be over, and we would find something else to occupy our time. In late November of that year, my mom entered the Davis Memorial Hospital for the birth of my brother. He was the first of my siblings to be born in a private hospital, and the excitement was mesmerizing. I went sometimes to the hospital with my dad to see Mom before the birth, but I was not allowed to go into the maternity ward because I was too young. So my dad would give me 10 cents and I would remain in the snack bar, which was located on the left of the lobby in the hospital. It was like heaven, the wonderful aroma of fresh pies and pastries, and with the 10 cents I was able to buy the pastry of choice, plus a glass of juice, and still got back change, which would be mine to keep. My brother John eventually came into existence at the very moment that the United States President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. This resulted in him being named John Fitzgerald. The excitement of his homecoming 3 days later was marred by the radio broadcast of President Kennedy's funeral. It was quite a somber occasion, as when Mom came home with the baby, there was an initial flurry of activity around this newborn for an hour or so, when our excitement was tempered by the sight of all the adults gathering around the radio, listening to the broadcast, some with teary eyes. I remember how hushed the narrator sounded, and of hearing the sound of the riderless horse's hooves through the radio, and tried to picture how grand it all seemed. This collective grief of the adults rubbed off on us children, as I recalled that when we eventually went outside to play with our friends, we played quietly, as we were all overcome with feelings of sadness. What was most remarkable was that even in our poverty and in our struggle to get by unscathed by the political disturbances in our country, we still had empathy for a people and nation far removed from us, and of whom we knew so little. My first day at school was marred in wonderment at the sheer number of children that were of my age. There were 7 or 8 classes in the section of the school where my class was. Each class had about 40 to 60 children, and the classes were separated by about 4 feet, with no walls separating one class from the other. I did not cry like some of the others. Perhaps it was because I knew that 2 of my older sisters were somewhere in the same school and would come to get me when it was time to go home. I enjoyed school, and the graduating position of 1st, 2nd, or 3rd in my class reports throughout my school days were more exciting to my parents and to the grown-ups than to me. I was always most excited on receiving the book lists of the books needed for the next class. When the day came for me to accompany my sister Liz, who was the one that took me to the bookstore to get the books, I couldn't think of anything more exciting. One of my proudest moments was when I became a member of the public library and could go on my own to the library. The old colonial building that housed our National Library was rather grand and intimidating. But once inside, the darkened corridors, the smell of old books, the polished hardwood floors, and the sheer quietness lent to its mystique. I so loved the smell of old library books that I'm sure this must be the reason for my interest in and collection of antique books with which I'm afflicted with today.